The year was 1305. London's streets bustled with life. The calls of street vendors echoed through the air. Horse hooves clattered against worn cobblestones, and the summer heat wrapped the city like a heavy cloak. But this particular August morning carried with it a different kind of anticipation. Crowds were gathering, not for a festival or market, but for something far darker, an execution that would become one of the most infamous in history. People had come from all over to see one man die, William Wallace, the Scottish knight who dared to stand against the might of England. He wasn't just another rebel. He had become a symbol, a rallying point for a nation's hopes and defiance. And that made his death more than punishment. It made it a statement. Over the centuries, films and legends have softened the image of Wallace's end. In pop culture, he's often portrayed as a tragic hero who died nobly and swiftly, a clean death for a noble cause. But the truth was something else entirely. What happened to Wallace wasn't just a death, it was a performance, one meticulously planned to terrify and control. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, wasn't simply exacting revenge. He was sending a message, loud, clear, and horrifying. Wallace was sentenced to a punishment so cruel it was reserved only for the worst traitors, hanging, drawing, and quartering. This wasn't about justice. It was about power, about making an example. It was meant to strip a man of every ounce of dignity, to turn his final moments into a warning etched into the collective memory of a nation. To understand just how brutal this was and why, we need to step back, to look at the world that made this possible. In the late 1200s and early 1300s, Scotland was a nation teetering on the edge, caught between independence and domination. The idea of Scotland as a unified, independent country was still forming. Loyalties weren't driven by nationalism as we think of it today. They were often driven by survival, by shifting alliances, by who held the upper hand in a given moment. The chaos began with a succession crisis, and Edward I saw his opportunity. To him, Scotland wasn't a neighbor. It was a problem to be solved, a rebellious province, and one he intended to bring to heel. Out of that chaos rose William Wallace. He wasn't a king or even a major noble. He was a minor landowner, a man shaped by personal loss, the kind that breeds fury. His family had suffered under English occupation. So when Wallace picked up his sword and led his men into battle at Stirling Bridge in 1297, it wasn't for glory. It was revenge and a vision. A belief that Scotland could be more than a vassal to another crown. His victory at Stirling Bridge wasn't just a military win. It shattered the myth of English invincibility. He'd proven that a group of determined Scots could stand against heavily armored English cavalry and win. But Edward wasn't the kind of king who let defiance slide. This was the same ruler who had brutally crushed Welsh uprisings and expelled the Jewish population from England. To him, rebellion was like wildfire, dangerous if not smothered completely. And Wallace had become a spark too bright to ignore. By 1305, most Scottish nobles had bent the knee to Edward, seeing survival as better than slaughter. But not Wallace. His refusal to submit made him more than an enemy. He was a thorn in everyone's side, even to some of his own countrymen. His continued defiance embarrassed the Scottish aristocracy, many of whom had already made peace with English rule. To them, Wallace was a reminder of the fight they had given up on. So capturing him wasn't just a military goal, it was political necessity. The manhunt for Wallace dragged on for years, The English crown poured money into spies, informants, and collaborators. Rewards were offered. Towns and strongholds were searched. Bit by bit, the net tightened. Friends became informants. Allies turned out of fear, greed, or just the cold calculation of survival. Wallace had become radioactive. To help him was to invite death. And when the betrayal finally came, it was from within. In August 1305, Wallace was taken near Glasgow. Most historians believe Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had pledged loyalty to Edward, played a key role in the capture. The details are debated, but the outcome was not. Wallace, the face of Scottish rebellion, was now in English chains. London celebrated. Wallace's capture was more than a military win. It was propaganda gold. But for Edward, this was just the beginning. His goal wasn't simply to kill Wallace. It was to break him, body, spirit, and symbol. Even the journey south was part of the punishment. Wallace wasn't just transported. He was paraded, marched through English towns under heavy guard, shown off like a trophy. People came out in droves to catch a glimpse of the infamous rebel. They jeered. They spat. The authorities encouraged it. This was psychological warfare, the transformation of a warrior into a sideshow. By the time he reached London, Wallace had been humiliated for weeks. But the worst was yet to come. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace was brought to trial at Westminster Hall. It wasn't a trial in any real sense. It was a performance, one held entirely in Latin, a language Wallace likely didn't even understand. He was charged with treason, murder, arson, sacrilege. The list went on. The irony? Wallace was accused of betraying a king he never recognized, and he said so. When asked to respond, he reportedly declared that he couldn't commit treason against Edward because he had never been Edward's subject. That single line, defiant and unapologetic, was the final nail in his coffin. Not that it mattered. The verdict had already been written. Edward's court wasn't interested in justice. It wanted a justification, a way to wrap unspeakable cruelty in the robes of legality. And so the charges were stacked high, to make the sentence seem proportionate. That sentence was pronounced with chilling formality. William Wallace would be dragged through the streets, hanged, but not to death, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and then quartered. Each step was symbolic. The dragging represented shame. The hanging was rejection from heaven. Disembowelment symbolized the destruction of compassion and spirit. Quartering? That was the complete erasure of identity. This wasn't a punishment. It was annihilation. And on the morning of his execution, London turned out to watch. By the time Wallace's trial wrapped up, the machinery of his execution was already in motion. Everything, from the route through London to the exact words spoken during the sentencing, had been planned down to the last detail. August 23, 1305, would be a date the English crown made sure no one would forget. That morning, London stirred with a strange kind of energy. The sun rose on a city prepared not just for justice, but for a show. Scaffolds had been erected. Vendors were already setting up, selling pies and ale. Parents brought their children. Locals and out-of-towners alike jostled for the best views. It was, quite literally, an execution made for the public eye, a medieval blend of punishment and pageantry. Wallace, stripped and bound, was tied to a wooden frame known as a hurdle. It wasn't just a means of transport, it was humiliation in motion. Dragged by horses through London's most crowded districts, his body scraped against the cobblestones, each jolt a new wound. This wasn't just a trip to the gallows. It was the opening act in a brutal performance meant to dehumanize the man long before the executioner's blade ever touched him. The route from the Tower of London wound through some of the busiest parts of the city. Wallace was made visible to thousands, ordinary citizens who gawked, mocked, or even cheered as he passed. Some threw filth, others just watched, wide-eyed. The crown wanted a spectacle, and the people delivered the atmosphere, a fusion of carnival and cruelty. By the time he reached Smithfield, the designated execution ground, Wallace had been transformed in the eyes of the crowd. Not just a man, but a symbol, either of rebellion crushed or of justice served, depending on who you asked. The scaffold waited, looming over a sea of faces, each one drawn to witness the climax of this grim production. The executioner, no stranger to this line of work, was a professional. His task wasn't just to kill. It was to do so slowly, publicly, and with the kind of precision that left a psychological scar. The first step was hanging. But Wallace wasn't meant to die here. Not yet. The rope was tied in such a way that it wouldn't break his neck, just slowly strangle him. His body convulsed as he dangled, face darkening, limbs twitching, and just as unconsciousness approached, he was cut down, still breathing, still alive. Then came the worst part: disembowelment. While Wallace was still conscious, the executioner began to slice open his abdomen. The process was slow, intentional. Organs were removed one at a time. Each one was held up to the crowd, a grotesque form of theater, before being tossed into a fire. The screams were said to be inhuman, something not easily described, only remembered. Witnesses said the sound of Wallace's agony was unlike anything they'd ever heard before. The symbolism of this was not lost on the people. In medieval belief, the bowels were thought to be the seat of feeling and compassion. Burning them while Wallace was still alive was an act of calculated psychological destruction. It wasn't enough to kill him. The execution had to annihilate his identity, his humanity. And yet, Wallace never begged. Contemporary reports say his eyes remained open, alert. Whether it was courage, numbness, or a state beyond pain, nobody truly knows. Some even claim he spoke, though whatever he might have said has been lost to history. If true, those words would have been spoken through a haze of unimaginable torment. Eventually, mercifully, the axe came. The executioner severed Wallace's head in a single stroke. The body that had endured so much finally lay still. But death didn't mark the end of the story. It marked the next phase of England's message. His head, still dripping with blood, was raised before the crowd, then preserved in tar and mounted on London Bridge, a grotesque warning to all. As for the rest of his body, it was quartered, cut into 4 parts, and distributed across the realm. Each quarter sent to a different Scottish town: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. These weren't just body parts. They were messages. Messages carved in flesh, declaring English power and the price of rebellion. This wasn't just execution. It was statecraft. It was performance. It was political communication in its most gruesome form. And in the immediate aftermath, it worked. Wallace's death shocked the Scottish resistance into silence, at least temporarily. Some of his former allies vanished. Others submitted, calculating that their lives were not worth ending the way his had. Wallace had been turned into a symbol, and the English hoped that symbol would be one of futility and failure. But Edward I, the infamous Longshanks, made a critical mistake. He misunderstood the Scottish spirit. He assumed that fear would end the dream of independence. Instead, Wallace's death ignited it. The brutality of the execution, the sheer theatrical sadism of it, had the opposite effect. It didn't smother resistance. It fanned the flames. Where once there was fragmented rebellion, there was now a cause, a martyr, a rallying cry. Wallace, the man, had been destroyed, but Wallace, the legend, had been born. Robert the Bruce, another key figure in Scottish history, was said to have been deeply affected by Wallace's death. Some say it steeled his resolve, showing him exactly what kind of future awaited a Scotland under English rule. Just 9 years later, Bruce would lead Scottish forces to a pivotal victory at the Battle of Bannockburn, a moment many credit as the turning point in the war for independence. Wallace's execution had changed the game. It wasn't just about land or titles anymore. It was about dignity, about memory, about justice. Scottish fighters began to embrace a no-surrender ethos. Death in battle became preferable to the kind of death Wallace had endured. His final moments became a benchmark for courage and a reason to keep fighting. The ripple effects went far beyond Scotland. Across Europe, rulers took note. The Wallace execution wasn't just an internal affair. It was international news. Foreign courts whispered of England's cruelty, of Longshanks's unflinching grip. Some admired his ruthlessness, others recoiled from it. But none ignored it. Wallace's death became a cautionary tale, not just for rebels, but for kings. It showed how power, when pushed to such extremes, can create martyrs instead of deterrents. That sometimes, the spectacle you design to kill a legacy only ends up enshrining it. That legacy, preserved in chronicles, ballads, and later films, refused to die. Centuries later, William Wallace is remembered not just for how he lived, but for how he died, and how that death reshaped a nation's sense of itself. In the years that followed, William Wallace's memory became almost mythic. Songs were written, stories were told by firelight, and children were raised on tales of the man who refused to bow, even at the cost of everything. His life was fractured by gaps in the historical record, but that only made the legend grow larger. People filled in the blanks with heroism, conviction, and sacrifice. And yet, the real Wallace was probably more complex than the myth allows. He was no flawless hero. He was a guerrilla leader, a tactician, and, by some accounts, a man capable of violence as brutal as the one he suffered. But that duality doesn't lessen his legacy. It deepens it. Because Wallace didn't just die for freedom, he died in full knowledge of the cost. And in a time when survival often meant submission, his refusal to yield carved his name into the bedrock of Scottish identity. Over 700 years later, the echoes of his execution still resonate. Every time someone in Scotland speaks of sovereignty, of heritage, of pride, there's a trace of Wallace there. Not in the romanticized sense of painted faces and war cries, but in the quiet defiance of a people who remember. There's a statue of Wallace that stands tall in Stirling today, not far from the site of his greatest victory. Tourists take photos, schoolchildren visit on field trips, and history buffs walk the paths where he once stood. It's a sanitized memory, to be sure. No one sees the blood or hears the screams anymore, but the meaning remains. His death was designed to erase him. It failed. Instead, it immortalized him. And that's the cruel paradox of power. The more violently it tries to silence a voice, the louder that voice can become in history. Edward Longshanks didn't just create a corpse. He created a martyr, and martyrs don't fade. They echo, they haunt, they inspire. William Wallace is no longer just a man. He's a reminder. that the human spirit, cornered and bloodied, can still rise, that the body can be broken, but the idea, never. That freedom, when faced with chains, sometimes answers with fire.